introduce online Dr. Hoda Heidari. She's an assistant professor in ethics and computational technologies at Carnegie Mellon University, and where she co-leads the university's Responsible AI initiative. Her work develops frameworks for evaluating fairness, accountability, and safety in AI systems. And her recent research, Risk Assessment for Generative AI, the Case of Red Teaming, is what she'll be discussing today.
Can I start, Leon? Great. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to my talk. I hope you all can hear me okay, but I trust that someone will let me know if not. So I am going to talk today about risk assessment for generative AI. In particular, I will go into some depth about red teaming as one prominent methodology for risk assessment of generative AI. So I would like to preface this talk by mentioning that generative AI evaluations, broadly construed, is a relatively nascent field. While there has been a flurry of activity over the past 2 or 3 years since the release of ChatGPT in this space, we don't yet have a rigorous toolbox to evaluate neither the capabilities nor the risks of generative models with any quantifiable confidence. Not only that, we don't agree on some key terms, goals, and criteria for some of these evaluations. And these themes, I hope, will clearly come through in the case study of red teaming, which I will talk about today. So my hope for this field is that in the near future, research efforts will be concentrated to move in the direction of making the field more mature. And I think that requires us to agree on a set of criteria for what it means for an evaluation methodology to be valid, reliable, feasible, and so on and so forth. Now, I think one important effort that needs to take place here is that we need to move beyond traditional benchmarking approach in AI and machine learning, more towards socio-technical methodology for evaluations. And my focus on red teaming is in part motivated by that. I think red teaming has the potential to be one such method to operationalize a more socio-technical lens towards evaluations of generative AI models. But obviously, for us to be able to count on it as an actual scientific methodology, we need to first have a shared understanding of what it constitutes. We need to provide practitioners with a set of actionable guidelines to perform red teaming, and we need to identify key research directions to provide us with practical and generalizable insights about red teaming. Okay. So with that, let me get started with a quick motivation. So I am sure that this audience is very familiar with the new paradigm, the new emerging paradigm in AI and machine learning, which is that of foundation models, or some people refer to them as frontier models or general purpose AI models. These are base models that can be fine-tuned in numerous application domains to perform a wide variety of tasks. Examples include, for example, summarizing patient visit notes, generating marketing text and images, accelerating the R&D process, giving people new ideas for innovation and coming up with new designs. In software engineering, they are used to automate code writing and testing and so on and so forth. So this is all very exciting, but over the past couple of years, unfortunately, we have observed, we have really seen ample evidence that if deployed haphazardly, these generative AI models can give rise to or amplify a variety of harms, some of which you can see here, including toxicity and bias, privacy violations, amplifying the spread of hate speech and misinformation, and longer-term negative impact on the economy and the environment. So prior work has in fact attempted to taxonomize these risks given the extensive nature of them. For example, here you can see the high-level categories that the taxonomy proposed by Weidinger et al. Offered for the risks of large language models in particular. So developing taxonomies of this type or typologies of risk is a useful method for risk identification. So risk identification is the first step toward a more comprehensive risk management enterprise. So let's talk a little bit about risk management more broadly. So risk at a very high level, the risk associated with any technology or activity, is broadly defined as the possibility of a negative or undesirable outcome or hazard happening as the result of deploying that technology or system in the real world. Now, risk by definition increases with the severity or impact of that adverse outcome and the likelihood of that outcome realizing. So it's the multiplication of severity and likelihood. So as an example, as a concrete example in the case of generative AI, you can consider toxicity as being the risk that we may wanna assess. So risk management at a high level consists of 4 major steps: identifying risks, assessing them, prioritizing them, and utilizing the resources available to mitigate those risks. So in more mature industries such as finance, insurance, health, and cybersecurity, we have well-established risk management practices. And in recent years, numerous entities, including NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology here in the US, have published risk management frameworks for AI in particular. Now, what makes risk management particularly challenging for generative AI? First, one thing we should note right off the bat is that risk management is not a purely engineering and scientific activity. Just by the definition of risk, whether and to what extent the outcome and implications of the technology are considered undesirable or negative can only be conceptualized with respect to human values in that particular context. Additionally, assessing the likelihood of a particular hazard often requires value-laden assumptions about how the world works. And different stakeholders of a given system may disagree on both the severity and likelihood of various potential hazards, marking one key challenge of assessing the risks associated with generative AI technologies. So the point here being that by nature, risk management always consists of making normative assumptions and choices. Sometimes there is broad consensus around those choices. For example, maybe in the context of managing the risks of airplanes flying, everybody agrees that a crash would be a bad outcome. Whereas the definition of toxicity could be very much dependent on the context, depending on who you ask, and so on and so forth. So that's one challenge. And second, the more general purpose a technology is, the more extensive its so-called risk surface is. So the risk surface of a technology consists of all the ways it can be misused or exploited to produce those undesirable outcomes or hazards that we want to avoid. Foundation models, as I mentioned earlier, can be fine-tuned and applied in numerous application domains and used by a wide variety of users and actors, leading to an extremely broad risk surface. And that's another key challenge of effective risk management for these technologies. So I'm not going to talk about all 4 stages of risk management. Instead, we are going to focus on risk assessment only for the remainder of this talk. So risk assessment is the second stage of risk management. The first stage, as I mentioned, is identifying the risk. What are the type of risks that we want to assess and mitigate later on? Once risks have been identified, risk assessment consists of analyzing the severity and likelihood of those risks. So again, depending on the scope of applicability and use of an AI system, if it's narrow, let's say spam filtering as an example, some types of risk, for example, the likelihood of false positive in a spam detection can be measured relatively confidently. We can even put numbers on them. In contrast to this spam filtering example, assessing foundation model risks such as the generation of toxic language broadly is much more challenging, again, in part due to the lack of consensus on what is considered toxic given the particular context of use. For example, depending on the context, the same output may or may not be considered toxic depending on the intent of the person asking the question. So the rest of this talk is going to be focused on risk assessment, and there are several methodologies proposed for risk assessment of AI systems. In particular, NIST recently published ARIA test environment proposes at least 3 key layers to risk assessment. Those include model testing, red teaming, field testing, And they should ideally be combined, and all of them should be conducted to capture the risks of AI in a comprehensive manner. So we are going to talk more about red teaming in a second, but let me also briefly tell you about model testing and field testing and field testing, because I want to make sure that it's clear that red teaming on its own is not the silver bullet. It's not the only type of risk assessment one has to do. Rather, it's one layer in a more layered approach to safety evaluations. So model testing at a high level refers to the familiar benchmarking tasks and data sets in AI and machine learning that are designed to test the prevalence and severity of specific types of risks. For example, again, going back to our concrete example of toxicity at the level of the model. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the traditional evaluation paradigm in machine learning, and it can be used as a kind of gut check. So model testing on its own is definitely not sufficient. For example, if you think about toxicity benchmarks, many of them rely on human annotators to determine whether something is toxic or not. And as you can imagine, changing those human annotators could completely change what is considered toxic in that benchmark, or changing the context in which those same prompts generate the same responses could have different implications. But the point being that this is the familiar way in which we have always assessed AI models. For example, for accuracy, we have this paradigm of doing train test splits and coming up with these numbers associated with accuracy. Much of what we have available in model testing relies on similar ideas. So while this is an important first step, it's by no means the last step of risk assessment. Red teaming I'm going to talk about, but then let me just briefly talk about field testing. Field testing, as the name suggests, aims to detect and document risks that arise in the environment in which the AI system is actually meant to be used. In other words, it focuses on risks under regular or everyday use by everyday users. And some of the key questions that we should ask when conducting field testing activities is: how do those users interact with the AI system? How do they perceive the AI-generated information in terms of, for example, what kind of risks they perceive to be likely? Are there demographic differences in those perceptions, and so on and so forth? So this requires designing careful human subject studies. So as just one example, again, this is all very nascent, but we recently conducted one such study to assess the risks perceived by UX researchers when they interact with LLM agents or personas as substitutes for human participants. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but it was very interesting the type of contextual risks that those researchers perceived when they defined a persona, they interacted with it as a substitute for human participant, and then they contrasted it with the experience they had interacting with actual human participants. Okay, so that's a quick overview of field testing. Now let me delve a little bit into red teaming. So President Biden last year signed the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI, which mentions red teaming particularly 8 times, mainly in the context of developing guidelines, standards, and best practices for AI safety and security, and it mandates NIST to establish guidelines, best practices, and industry standards for evaluating and auditing AI capabilities, especially those that could cause harm, such as in the area of cybersecurity and biosecurity. So this motivated us to conduct our study on red teaming, and at the time when we conducted the study I'm going to tell you about, which was about a year ago, our observation was that despite red teaming's central role in policy discussions and corporate messaging surrounding safety evaluations for AI, significant question remains about what precisely it means, how it relates to conventional red teaming practices in cybersecurity, how it should be conducted, and what role it should or should not play in the future evaluation and regulation of generative AI. So we set out to offer a common ground understanding of red teaming as a methodology for risk assessment. So this is the work that I'm going to tell you about in the rest of this talk. So first I'm going to give you some background and some history about red teaming. Then I'm going to provide a brief overview of several AI red teaming exercises that had been conducted by industry practitioners at the time when we conducted this study, as well as recent research advances on red teaming. And we also looked at the comments that were submitted to NIST as suggestions for the process of developing guidelines for red teaming. So those three were the source of our data. And what we observed was a lack of consensus around the scope, structure, and assessment criteria for AI red teaming. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those findings. So again, based on our analysis of those three data sources, one is publicly available reports on AI red teaming exercises in industry. The second one is research contributions on red teaming. And the third, the comments submitted to NIST on the topic of red teaming. We compiled a structured question bank to guide and scaffold future red teaming exercises. And I will tell you about those criteria, which we break into considerations before, during, and after AI red teaming, and I will wrap up with some key directions for future work. I should mention that the work that I'm about to present was led by these three amazing students at Carnegie Mellon, Michael, Anusha, and Leslie, and our paper recently won a Best Paper Award at the AIES conference, the ACM and AAAI conference on AI ethics and society. Okay, so let me begin with some quick background on red teaming. Before I do that, how am I doing on time? I know we don't want to use the full 30 minutes that I have planned for. Alright, I'm getting a thumbs up, so I assume I can keep going. Okay, so the concept of red teaming originated centuries ago in the context of warfare. And in more recent history, the US military used it in reference to models of the Soviet Union's behavior, in contrast to the quote-unquote blue teams that are meant to represent the US. As a methodology in cybersecurity, red teaming aims to assess an organization's security by simulating cyber attacks. And this is designed to identify vulnerabilities or security holes in the system. So kind of by simulating the adversary, the idea is that we get better at detecting holes. And this is meant to help determine what needs to be improved to defend the organization about real-world cyber threats, which is the job of the so-called blue team. So red teaming in cybersecurity is often followed by blue teaming. So importantly, red teaming in computer security involves modeling a specific adversary and mapping out the space of vulnerability from a specific threat lens. And this is in contrast to auditing, which is often not adversarial in nature. So with auditing, you're trying to understand what's going on. With red teaming, you're trying to adversarially stress test the system to detect the holes. So many organizations with the traditional cybersecurity red teaming actually called on this to develop guidelines for AI red teaming based on cybersecurity red teaming best practices. And some of those best practices include the creation of an AI vulnerability disclosure center and a comprehensive incident response plan for generative AI. So I have had many additional conversations with cybersecurity experts, and some of them believe that practical guidelines don't even exist for cybersecurity red teaming. That said, cybersecurity red teaming has been around for longer, so there is definitely more we can learn there. So for concreteness, let me just provide a quick definition for AI red teaming, and this is from the Presidential Executive Order. It defines red teaming as a structured testing effort to find flaws and vulnerabilities in an AI system, often in a controlled environment and in collaboration with AI developers. It is most often performed by dedicated red teams that adopt adversarial methods to identify flaws and vulnerabilities, such as harmful and discriminatory outputs from AI systems, unforeseen and undesirable system behavior, limitation and potential risk associated with the misuse of the system. So the key terms here, I've tried to highlight them. It's structured testing to detect flaws and vulnerabilities. in an adversarial manner usually requires AI expertise. So with that history and definitions out of the way, let's take a quick look at AI red teaming activities that were conducted in the industry. And here you can see the link to some of those activities. So I won't go into the detail of any of these activities, but instead I will tell you our synthesis of takeaways from the 6 red teaming activities that you can access here. In fact, it was one of the main suggestions that were brought up to NIST's attention by industry players was to collect case studies of this nature, illustrations and examples of red teaming to exemplify best practices and state-of-the-art in red teaming. Unfortunately, when we looked at these, the publicly available evidence, they very much were divergent. Although I should note that our analysis is based on publicly available sources on these red teaming activities, and because they were public-facing, they were limited in the level of detail and information available to them. So we definitely did not have full information about these red teaming activities. So what were our takeaways? So first, what we observed was that language models have been the primary object of recent red teaming evaluations. As you know, there are all sorts of multimodal language models that, at the time at least, they had not been red teamed. Second, what we observed was that the target vulnerabilities of these activities ranged from highly specific objectives, for example, to investigate risks to national security, to much broader targets, such as simply uncovering harmful model behavior. Red teaming efforts were usually focused on probing these broader vulnerabilities, such as producing harmful or offensive model output, and it appears that the designers of the activity often focus on these broader vulnerability in the hopes that it will result in greater variation in findings, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, it is often impossible to fully understand the model's entire risk surface or list all possible failure modes. That said, probing non-specific threat models runs the risk of not necessarily covering a wide range, but rather incentivizing red teamers to focus on easy-to-surface hazards. So in some cases, red teaming was conducted by internal teams prior to model release. In some other cases, it was conducted on publicly released models through API access. Team composition varied widely from groups of subject matter experts to random samplings of the population to synthetic LLM agents performing red teaming on the GenAI model itself. The resources available to evaluation teams also varied based on team composition. For crowdsourced teams, red teaming efforts were usually time-boxed, either because of the participant or the task. And access to model were available only through APIs. For teams with subject matter expertise, on the other hand, red teaming efforts were more open-ended with fewer strict restrictions on time and compute power. So red teaming activities varied considerably in process and methods as well. Some organizations, for example, chose to conduct a single round of red teaming, while others saw red teaming as a much more iterative process in which results from the initial rounds feeds into the next round to prioritize risks and do further investigations. We found significant variations in publicly shared information about the output of red teaming efforts. In some cases, specific examples of harmful behavior uncovered through red teaming was shared. In cases focused on national security in particular, specifics of harmful behavior were not publicly disclosed because the findings were deemed too sensitive. And finally, what we observed was the specific of what should be done next. The risk mitigation strategies after the red teaming were oftentimes not provided and evaluated. So the picture that I hope you take from this is that really these activities diverge. Different entities have done them differently, and at least at the time when we looked at existing prior red teaming exercises, there weren't that many shared commonalities between them. We obtained similar takeaways when we did an extensive literature review of recent research on AI red teaming. We broke them down into red teaming activities that were manual and human-centered, those that combined manual with AI auxiliary tools, those that relied on algorithmic search and targeted attacks. We observed that in general there was a prevalence of ad hoc approaches to identify the target risk. It was mostly up to the authors to decide what kind of risk they wanted to prioritize. And also there was a wide range of methods to perform red teaming with the goal of surfacing those risks, but a lot of those methods focused on automating the process of red teaming. Okay, so at a very high level, if I'm to sum up our observations so far, our analysis revealed a glaring lack of consensus around the scope, structure, and assessment criteria for AI red teaming. We decided to utilize our observations to propose a set of essential criteria and considerations that we thought should be part of any effective AI red teaming guidelines. And we break down these into pre-activity, within-activity, and post-activity criteria. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go to the detail of any of these, but if you're interested, there is a whole lot of sub-questions under each of these questions that I'm presenting here. But pre-activity, before we even start doing red teaming, there are several key questions we need to address. The first one is, what is the specific artifact under the evaluation through red teaming? Is it, for example, an AI model in isolation, or is it the broader system in which this AI system should be embedded? It is important to specify the threat model the red teaming activity aims to probe. It is often a good idea to focus on a small number of threat models as opposed to leaving it open. It is important to think about what is the specific vulnerability or hazard that the red teaming aims to surface, and why that particular one has been prioritized. What are the criteria for assessing the success of red teaming activity? If our goal is to make sure that red teaming doesn't simply become a performative exercise and it actually leads to actionable insights, we need to specify before we start conducting the activity that what is it that we consider a successful red teaming activity. It is important to be intentional about the composition of the red team and who will be part of the red team. As you can imagine, different people conducting the same red teaming activity will lead to very different findings. So once the activity starts, we need to be clear about what resources are available to the red teamers, and does it realistically mirror that of the potential adversary or the threat model we have in mind. For example, if we are time boxing the activity, we need to ask ourselves, is that a reasonable assumption to make? The level of compute that we are making available to red teamers is another important consideration on their resources. The kind of instructions we offer to participants, as with any human-centered experiment or study, the kind of instructions we provide to participants can have a huge impact in terms of framing and guiding the activity. The kind of access participants have to the model, for example, whether it's an API access or full access to the model, can completely change the result, and we need to be specific about what kind of access they have and why it is that we are focusing on that kind of access. The kind of auxiliary methods that are available to team members could also lead to very different outcomes. If participants have AI expertise, for example, or auxiliary AI tools can be effectively made available to them, that's something to think about carefully. And finally, once the activity has been done, it is important to be clear about what reports and documentations should be produced on the findings of the activity, who should have access to those reports, when and why, and if certain details are withheld and deemed too sensitive, there has to be clear justifications for them. After the activity has been conducted, it is important to be transparent about the resources that it consumed and whether it is actually successful in terms of the criteria that was specified pre-activity. And finally, and this is the limitation we observed, it is important that red teaming activity is followed by a blue teaming activities in proposing measures to mitigate the risks identified through red teaming. So these are some of the criteria that we think designers of red teaming activity should be very careful about specifying, and they should have very good justification as to for the specific design they come up for the red teaming activity. In the future, we think it is important to scientifically look at the impact of each of the factors we have identified as on the outcome of the red teaming activity. As I was going through them, I gave you some of my hypothesis about how, for example, the team composition, we can imagine that would can have huge implications for the output of red teaming, the kind of access, and so on and so forth. But these are at the moment the qualitative, speculations that have not been scientifically verified. So I think that's an extremely important direction for future research in this space, so that we have scientific evidence for the kinds of guidelines we propose to practitioners. One specific approach that we propose is the so-called red teaming cards, which is a structured set of questions we have in our papers, and we think as a starting point, it's a good idea for designers and practitioners of red teaming to fill out that form, pre-activity, within activity, and post-activity, and make them publicly available. So I am going to stop here, and I'd be happy to answer to any questions you may have for me.